Hello and welcome to our next video in our series of teaching learning videos. This next one is going to be on retrieval with myself and Syd, and today we've got an extra person, which is going to be Rob. The reason for that is that myself and Syd know plenty about lots of bits of teaching, but a little bit less about retrieval. And hopefully Rob's going to enlighten us a little bit about retrieval. So on to the first bit. So we're going to talk generally about retrieval. Rob, tell us a little bit more about your experience in retrieval.
It scratched an itch with something that I wanted to incorporate more in our regular lessons as a whole department. We like to standardize resources. We like to share practice across our department. And what we were struggling with was a way to regularly test students that didn't feel intimidating and didn't make them feel like they were getting anxious ahead of the lesson time. We wanted them to be excited for lesson and things. But we also wanted to make sure that we were regularly testing in a way that was spacing out the practice and the testing so that we could help them build those different connections with subjects so they could enhance their subject knowledge. And then eventually, through this regular testing, that anxiety I was talking about before would lessen. So much so that by the time we got to the summer exams, we thought, they'll be ready. They'll have that mindset of this is just like, and I am ready because. And the retrieval was aimed around that, and boosting our resources and the way we were leading it was all aimed at trying to improve that kind of subject build-up and that progress amongst our students.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting because a lot of what I've kind of like seen before and read about retrieval in terms of CPD before has been very much what I would kind of consider remembering as opposed to kind of preparing kids for the subject, and in terms of just like quick quizzes and things within lesson, as opposed to it being almost like 2 or 3 pronged as to be things they can do at home in terms of kind of flashcards that they prep themselves to retrieve, things that subject teachers do, and then also thinking about different types of activity to make them retrieve in different ways.
Yeah, we had to make sure that the activities we're using were varied enough as well, because we didn't want to become too repetitive, because then it would just become a bit predictable for them. We wanted them to keep doing something maybe slightly different each time. We also let them in on the idea. So we made it very clear to them, this is what we're doing, this is what we're trying. And we even now run specific revision sessions about how they can build their own retrieval practice resources. The flashcard sessions using the Leitner method and making the challenge grids that we use every week with them, they are now coached on so they can build them and they can self-test each other. I also think because there's not a great deal of educational research that happens in a sixth form setting, I think that link between exam readiness and the benefits of retrieval aren't as emphasized in a lot of literature that I read, because it is often very aimed at primary school settings or secondary settings, which again do have some exam component, but not in the same way.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think later on that I think I was going to mention myself about the way that we in computer science prepare kids for some of the sort of longer answer questions. So I think we'll definitely come to that. But I really like what you said about sharing it with them in terms of we're not just doing it to you, we're involving you and giving you the skills that you can take away to actually do this when you're at home. Definitely.
Seems like you found a sweet spot there where all your students have learned to enjoy retrieval. So that's really nice.
Yeah, and they're using the term. So they're not just seeing it as a starter, which is what I probably would have called it, or a starter of plenary. It depends where I put it in the lesson. But I would have seen it as an independent activity, whereas they now see it as part of building their subject knowledge. So they see the benefit of retrieval, where they look at retrieval practice as its own thing, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, kind of this is the thing we always get shown in CPD, the kind of the idea that, you know, we learn it, we review, etc., etc. And, you know, I mean, it's fairly obvious, I think, the idea that if you revisit it, so on and so forth. But it's actually quite powerful to just think, well, you know, you don't just do something once and it's going to stay in. You have to do it again. But, and this is the biggie for me, it's not just doing the same thing. It's not just repetition. It's let's do it and then do it for a purpose, and usually a different purpose.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the biggie.
Yeah, the students have to be on board with that idea as well, don't they? Otherwise they might get annoyed when they find it quite difficult. So I think it's probably nice to show them that graph and actually say, this is why we're doing retrieval and this is what retrieval is, as Rob has said, explaining the purpose behind the activities and getting that variety and getting them on board. You want to find that sweet spot between desirable, difficulty and not too easy, don't you? And I think giving them that variety and that purpose helps them get on board with what they're doing and why.
Yeah.
It's also showing them that bigger picture. It's really useful at the start of a new topic to point out and emphasize to them a lot of what we're asking you to retrieve now is from further back. Here's the reason why. Here's the context of it. If they find something particularly difficult, we were doing retrieval of different trends and patterns across period 3 on the periodic table with our second years recently, because it's relevant to some of the stuff they're doing in second year. After the activity, it took a lot more effort than I think some of them were expecting. We then made it really plainly clear to them, right, in about 3 weeks' time, we're going to repeat this exact same activity. So between now and then, there needs to be some space practice of this work. You'll repeat the exact same activity, and then we'll compare past you to present you, and we'll have a look at that progress side by side to look for those gaps as well. But look for those opportunities to celebrate that retrieval in a really positive way.
Yeah.
And so even repeating some of the activities with the right context can be incredibly beneficial.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. I think the next thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is, again, this is the classic 3 of a CPD. And I've got views on these 3, which I'm not going to sort of preempt too much, which is kind of like the classic, the low stakes quiz, the kind of, and number 2 is the one that you definitely will see in I think almost all lessons.
Yeah.
Whether you think of it as retrieval or not, the 2 things activity, where essentially it's the let's write down something we've learnt activity, and then what you might think of as the brain dump, where you bring out, well, what's in your brain on this topic. What do we think of those 3? Pros and cons.
The low stakes quizzes option, just to begin right at the top of the list of things, love it. Has to have a different variety though. We use the challenge grids for them. We actually do use quizzes. We use quizzes where we don't show them the questions. They just have to hear it from us. So we try and keep the format of that fresh. There are different softwares you can use for this. Some softwares that are perhaps a little bit more flashy than others for no reason. Yeah. I do think there's a lot of benefit in it, and we often get students to put their answers in an exercise book that we don't mark, but that they can keep a personal record for, because it allows them to make those corrections on their subject knowledge without me taking in any score from anything. It's meant to be make mistakes, build from that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think when we've talked about things like assessment, feedback, and questioning before in earlier things we've done, it's kind of important, I think, to have that kind of low pressure ability to just go, well, we'll just do it, and you're allowed to make mistakes, you can mess this up, and then at a different point you do need to get this right now, and have the difference between the 2.
Try it, get it wrong, but don't leave it blank.
I think it's really important that they do get it wrong sometimes, because if they always get it right, then they don't feel they need to improve, do they? And there's no motivation going forward into the next activity. Also, would you say that these retrieval activities work best with self-marking then?
Yes and no. With the low stake quizzes, maybe, but I think that ability for me to correct and to explain a correction is something quite useful. I find a lot with A-level, students get very familiar with what a mark scheme will say and how to use a mark scheme. But I sometimes worry that there's not enough there telling them why it's that. And I think for a lot of exam boards now who use multi-choice, there's an opportunity where that can happen, and students can not actually feel like they're getting any better, or not actually know any more about chemistry, for example, but they are able to mark their work using a guide that isn't really enhancing their learning. So I think there's a risk with it, potentially, a bit.
Yeah, does that apply to the second one? So the 2 things you've learned today, are they going to get any feedback from that?
I think it's always incredibly important to give them some sort of feedback on what they've done, because otherwise they have no what do I do next, or what do I need to stop doing. There's that timeline around any activity with this that does need that demonstration of what to do. But again, if for chemistry, if it was an image, if it was a mechanism, something like that, there could be some self-marking involved there, and then some whip round with the teacher looking over it. I do think sometimes that deeper level of explanation, though, is really beneficial, as long as it doesn't interrupt the lesson too much.
I think it can also be, I think looking number 2 and number 3, it can also be, how far through the process are you?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, if you've only just learned it, or it's the second time you're coming around to it, well, maybe you want to just see what few things you do know, and then gather from other people, well, what other bits do I need to kind of add to my knowledge? And then when you're getting to 3, you probably should know pretty much everything, and you want to get it out ready to then maybe answer an exam question, do something a bit deeper with it.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's how far through the process you are.
With brain dumps, I always use the word blurting, actually, because I'm not great with the phrase brain dump. That's just a personal preference. The alternative to number 3 for brain dumps, for me, was expand and elaborate. Because I found that students had a little bit more of an instruction with what they were meant to do with it.
Yeah.
So they are given 2 completely correct phrases from a past topic and a current link to what they're doing now. And what they need to do is expand and elaborate on those statements. I sometimes find that the barrier of freedom almost to the brain dump or the blurting, whatever you call it, is maybe a bit too high for some students.
Well, so I think that's kind of where I was going with the next thing we were thinking was, is it important that we then think, well, especially when we're quite a long way through the process, do we then sort of think about, well, we're going to learn it better if we do something a bit deeper with it? I've kind of put this in because this is one of those classic bits of research, which is a bit of a myth, but it's kind of a useful myth because it's full of those percentages which don't really mean that much. We don't guarantee that if we teach someone something, we're going to learn 90%, etc. But we will learn more of the things we do something at a higher cognitive level. And I think the thing I was thinking was, for example, if we do the brain dump or the blurting, as you put it, in computer science, if I'm doing like a 9-mark question, the way that I always phrase it is, okay, when we know we're going to have in the question at least 1, probably 2 elements of subject knowledge. So the first thing is, for your first 1, 2, 3, 4 marks, you essentially get everything in your brain on those 2 bits of subject knowledge, and you stick them on the page.
Yeah.
And then what you have to then do is go, okay, we're going to get those 2 things, and then we're going to apply it to the context that's in the question.
Yeah.
And then once we've done that, we then move on and we then evaluate it within the further context that will be around the question. And you're then basically doing that element of retrieval at a deeper level. And if you do a few of those types of activities with it, you should hopefully get it a bit deeper than just, what do I know on this topic?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think that the funny thing is as well, students don't know that they actually understand the explanation behind a concept that they may have dumped down onto their bit of paper or into their blurt. They've probably spurted facts out or concepts, and they actually understand things behind them, but they don't find it easy to explain those concepts, whereas they do find it easy to get the facts down on the page. So as you were saying, the first 2 or 3 marks, and they find it more difficult to get the next bit down. They're taking it further, they elaborate, but actually they do know that bit because they can't possibly not know it without knowing the concept itself, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think they struggle to explain what they know, but they probably do know more.
Yeah, but it's, I think if they've had that kind of experience of having the retrieval applied to several different contexts a few times, they get used to that process of, well, I do know it, and if I do get an unfamiliar context, I can have a go at applying it.
There's a massive risk, especially with, say, the blurting, the brain dumps with it, that you can end up alienating students who don't respond well to that level of vagueness, that level of freedom with things. If we think about supporting lots of different types of learner, then we often use scaffolding for lots of activities, and then it's almost forgotten when I see some retrieval practice activities that are available out there, and you think, have you really supported your whole class with that? Is everyone able to make progress in the way? So I do find the expand and elaborates sort of narrow that a little bit, because it gives them a little bit more focus of what to do. But then we've got graphics up in chemistry, and when we are doing the blurting, when we are getting to just think whatever you know about it, we've already had that discussion with them that you would need to go through your themes of, is there a diagram? Is there a trend? Is there a calculation? Is there some recall? Can you expand on any of what you've already got on the page with the time you've got left?
Yeah.
Having that, setting the scene like that with them develops a good culture. But if you just go in and say, please tell me everything you know about catalyst, go 3 minutes, then you're going to find a lot of stress more than anything else. So I don't think it's as beneficial.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. Right, yeah, so a little bit of a summary. I think we got the idea that, this idea of doing things repeatedly is going to deepen how it goes into your long-term memory. And I think the biggest thing we've kind of taken from it is that range of strategies. There's lots of different ways to do it.
So many.
Yeah. What your thoughts, Syd?
Yeah, I think at the end of all of our teaching, and culminates in exams, the students obviously have to discriminate what they're being asked in an exam question. And so some of these retrieval practices might not help them in that, might not help them to problem solve what am I being asked about. So I think we do need to be careful with the types of retrieval that we do. And I am going to take on your advice when you say expand and elaborate, not just blur everything, because it is probably too much freedom and the students do need that guidance. So yeah, I definitely think that was useful.